What are you expecting? What are you seeing out there in terms of numbers of jobs and wages?
Well, the job growth we're seeing, particularly on small businesses, is about flat to where it was last month. Down a little bit. The growth rate's down a little bit for small businesses under 50 employees from last year. And we would kind of expect that with the unemployment rate so low and full employment. From a wage growth standpoint, it really depends on the size of the company. When you think about small companies, really small, which make up a lot of the economy, they're seeing a lot less wage increases. The employers under 5 employees, and there's a lot of those, are only seeing less than 2% wage increase, where the larger companies are definitely giving more wage increases.
But does that mean those smaller companies just don't need to pay higher wages? There isn't the same shortage of the laborers that they need?
Well, I think there's some less turnover there in those smaller companies, but really I think it's because they don't have the ability to do it. You know, they didn't get as big a benefit from tax reform because they're not as profitable as some of the larger companies, and they also can't raise prices many times. They're smaller. They don't have as much flexibility to increase wages as some of the larger companies do.
So Marty, a little bit earlier, Alan Kruger raised the specter of Amazon and what they did, announcing that $15 minimum wage. I'd love to get your perspective, and then we'll go back to Alan to get his. Is that going to change your business or the business as you look at it if we have this $15 minimum wage?
Well, I think it definitely puts pressure on certain companies, those that are looking for a large number of hourly employees that tend to turn over a lot and may go from job to job. So I think it is going to put pressure on driving up kind of that minimum wage to attract that employee. I think, as Alan said, I think it will put that positive pressure on to drive it up. But you're also seeing a lot of minimum wage increases across the states pushing toward that $15 anyway. And I think the thing you got to watch out for is kind of with Amazon, are they taking away anything like bonuses or other incentives to give that wage increase, and what's more important to those hourly employees?
So, Alan, I want to come back to that, but first let's talk about Amazon specifically. It's no coincidence, it strikes me, that it happened to Amazon, because we'll put a chart up that shows that retail average earnings lag significantly below overall average earnings in the economy, and it's been a growing gap over time.
That's right. That's the direction the economy has been moving. One concern is that very large monopolistic companies like Amazon could put downward pressure on wages and are affecting the labor market. So I think it's a very significant step that they raised their lowest wage. They also announced that they're going to lobby for Congress to raise the federal minimum wage. And as Marty mentioned, the states have been raising their state minimum wages, but the federal minimum wage remains at $7.25 an hour. A little under half the states don't have a state minimum wage. And I'm curious if Marty is seeing that many of those small companies in the states which don't have their own minimum wage, so they're paying $7.25, or the minimum wage is $7.25 an hour. If you're still seeing a lot of employment taking place at that low $7.25 an hour minimum wage, which hasn't changed for 9 years.
Marty?
Well, yeah, Alan, we still see the employment, but the biggest employment growth actually is, in those regions like the South, where there's been fewer minimum wage increases, less pressure on those small businesses. Where out west, where there's been more minimum wage increases, Phoenix, Arizona, California, Seattle, that employment has been a little bit slower, and the growth rate is a little bit smaller in those companies, at least under 50 employees, because of the pressure of those minimum wage increases. So it's really a very regional from that standpoint.
Hey, Marty, you brought this up earlier, saying that the minimum wage thing is great, but if they take something else away. So Amazon raising minimum wage but taking away bonuses, like what effect does that have overall, Marty?
Well, it really depends on, how good the incentive is. And when you're talking about hourly employees, many times it's much more important to them to get the absolute wage rate. And so I think that was an important move for Amazon and for others, that you will see that pressure to raise the wage rate and maybe take away some of those other things to kind of balance the cost out. Because if I'm an hourly employee, the wage rate and the certainty of my pay is much more important.
So, sorry, Alan Kruger, you mentioned earlier the monopolistic tendencies in some employers. Actually, is it help break that down if you go to straight out wages as opposed to these other things you can have on the side? Because it's harder to compete. It's harder to compare what one employer is taking to another if it's an extra days off or a little bit of this, a little bit of that.
That's right. And one of the things that employers have gotten better at is what we call price discrimination or wage discrimination. Paying a different wage to different groups of workers. And doing it in a way in which it's not so transparent. So I think moving more towards the base wage will hopefully raise wages more generally across the board. It's also, I think, important to recognize Amazon hires a lot of seasonal workers, a lot of part-time workers for the holidays. Those part-time workers typically don't get bonuses anyway, so for them this is just a pure increase in their compensation.
Alan, you also have a question for Marty?
I was curious, Marty, if you've been able to look at with Amazon reducing some of the bonus pay and the stock incentives, how much of that is coming from higher paid workers and being redistributed more to the entry workers or lower wage workers versus how much of it is just coming just from the low wage workers?
Yeah, no, we haven't seen much detail on that yet for Amazon, exactly how they did that. But typically what you do see is a little bit fewer incentives, as you said, on the lower end for those hourly wages, because that's more important to them. And on the higher end, there's more of the incentives that you see in more salaried workers. And you're definitely, from a wage rate, it's interesting, the hourly workers are certainly seeing a bigger wage increase. We see about 3.4% versus salaried workers that are seeing many times 2% or under. Because it's because of the minimum wage increases and the really war on talent for those hourly workers. And the other positive note that really people don't mention too much right now is while the wage rate is around 2.5% generally, we're seeing net pay up about 5% for most employees because of tax reform. So in the net pay, they're actually seeing almost double the wage rate increase because of tax reform this year.
Marty, one of the things that Alan has written about and spoken about is the extent to which you have large employers really have a lot of power over employees. What is the situation from your point of view? If you take your business over the last 5 years, has there been increasing concentration, that is to say, less small businesses formed and coming into you, or is it increasing? Where do you see that?
No, really since the recession, we're back at the normal rate of new business startups. So we're still seeing a lot of brand new businesses start up. It took a few years to get back to that normalized level, but we're still seeing that. But large businesses, certainly we're seeing more wage increases coming out of, when you talk about wages, coming out of those large businesses because they can afford to do it because of tax reform and a little bit more pricing power. They can also, offer more benefit packages, and that's another thing that's pretty positive, away from the pay incentives, but benefit, health care, insurance, paying back loans for people with student loans. Those things are becoming more popular to balance out the wage increases, particularly with large companies.